All right, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Helen Thomas, and this is the CDFM study group. All right, today we're going to be reviewing CDFM Module 1, Competency 1, the Government Resource Management Environment, and we're utilizing the 2020 Revised Study Guide. So I'm going to begin on page 1.1.5. As I'm going through the information, if you have questions that you don't mind being recorded, please stop and ask your question at that point, because it only compounds later if you don't have the answer to the question that you need now. So like on page number 5, when you're studying, you don't necessarily have to memorize the date. I don't know if you remember, like back in high school, they're like, okay, what year was the Constitution took effect? March 4th, 1789. For this particular purpose, you just need to know the order in which they occur. You know that the Declaration of Independence was first, then you have the Articles of Confederation ratified. The U.S. Constitution was ratified by 9 states. And then the Constitution took effect March 4th, 1789. And then the purpose of all of this structure and the Articles of Confederation is to have that separation of powers. So in the separation of powers, that's how we have the 3 branches of government. The 3 branches of government, you need to learn them in this order: legislative or Congress, executive or the president, judicial or the courts. You got to excuse me because I'm from the Virgin Islands and some words are hard to pronounce. So I have to slow down a little bit. All right, page 6, 1.6 talks about the roles of the 3 branches of government. So we're going to go into those shortly. So the Constitution, again, have some general principles and guidelines for Congress and the president, and the courts will then verify what is constitutionally good or not. All right, so let's go on page 8. Page 1.1.8 talks about Article 1, the legislative process, or legislative branch or Congress. So the reason that I requested for you to learn them in that order is because it directly aligns with the Constitution. Article 1 talks to Congress. So legislative branch is covered in Article 1 of the Constitution. And then as you look under Article 1, you see Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 7. What you need to know is what do they say? So Section 1 says for the Congress, you will have 2 sides. You have the Senate and you have the House of Representatives. Section 2 says that our House of Representatives are individuals that will serve 2-year terms. When you read through that paragraph, what I'm doing is I'm pulling out the important information. If you have a hard copy of the book, I would advise you in the margins, and I'll kind of pull mine out so you'll see. And I can't see my video that good. So in the margins or side, outside of that particular paragraph, after you've read the paragraph and you get the important information, write it off to the side. So that's what I have on mine. So Section 2 says House of Representatives serve 2-year terms. Section 3 says the senators serve 6-year terms. And then Article 1, Section 7 is what grants Congress the authority to raise money for the government, generate revenue. It originates in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with the amendments. Also in Section 7 at the top of page 9, and later on you'll see it come up again, it says that when the Congress sends the president a bill, the president has 10 days to sign off on that bill. But if you continue to read, you'll see what it says. And I will read verbatim. If any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, Sundays excluded, after it shall have been presented to him or her, because we will have a her one day, the same shall be a law. So that means Congress is in session and a bill is sent to the president. If the president does not sign that bill within 10 days, it automatically becomes law under Article 1, Section 7. And you'll see this again in a different format when we talk about presidential actions. This also says, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress is adjourned. So this is another term for what you hear, pocket veto. Pocket veto means Congress is not in session, but a bill was sent to the president. The president does nothing with it. It does not automatically become law. It's called a pocket veto. If y'all see anyone trying to come into the meeting, go ahead and accept them in, because we have a lot of outside guests who do not have direct access. And please make sure you mute your phones or mute your computers unless you have a question. So any questions on Section 7? It's got a lot of information in there, but it's a building block for information you're going to see later on. Any question? All right. So it says you got two options. The president receives the bill within 10 days. Congress is in session. If the president does not sign the bill, it automatically becomes law. Versus if the bill is sent to the president, but Congress is adjourned or not in session, and the president does not sign the bill, it does not automatically become law, and it is called a pocket veto. Additionally, in Section 7, it mentions the veto process where the president can veto, but when you read through that paragraph, it'll tell you that 2/3 of the Congress can override a presidential veto. So that's what I pulled out of that paragraph. If you're in the 2020 book, it's page 1.1.9 at the top, Section 7 of Article 1. Section 8 has a lot of things in there. Congress shall have the power to levy taxes, right? Congress have the power of the purse. They control the money. They can borrow money, regulate, declare war. So as you're thinking of, and again, I'm thinking of studying for an exam like this, is you need to know what right looks like so that when you see something different, you'll understand it. So now you've learned what the functions of Congress is and and I'll go over Section 9 in a little bit. So on an exam, if I'm a test writer and I do not see the ASMC exam, but I've been a test writer and I know how it works. What you will see, it might say under Article 1, Section 8, the president is allowed to do XYZ. True or false? Actually, can anyone answer that? Let's say under Article 1, Section 8, the president is allowed to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Is that true or false?
False.
Okay, why is that false?
Because Congress is the one that has the power to do these, not the president.
Right. So the key words there, Article 1, automatically Congress, legislative branch. So if they say Article 1 and then they bring president in there, well, president is not part of the legislative branch. So process of elimination, you got to be able to do that. And so you know it's false because the president is not covered under Article 1. So I just wanted to point that out. So you kind of just look at the list. No, I don't tell individuals to memorize everything on there, But what you would see is the majority of the functions of the government falls within our Congress, not the president. The president is very limited in what he or she can do. If you don't remember none of these sections, every financial manager should remember Section 9. Why? Because this is the reason the government shuts down if we don't have an appropriation law. And it reads, no money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement of and account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. When you read this stuff, you need to figure out, okay, what are they talking about? It says, no, we cannot take any money out of the treasury, which is the country's bank. That's where we get our money. When we're doing transactions as financial manager, everything is triggered from the treasury. So it says, if there's no appropriation in place, no appropriation law, no temporary appropriation law or continuing resolution, this is the law that says the government will shut down because the treasury is closed until we have an appropriation law. So if you don't remember any one of these other ones, the House of Representatives served 2 years, the senators served 6 years, and so forth and so forth, you need to know Section 9. No money, that's the reason the government shuts down. So that is Article 1. 3 branches of government, legislative or Congress, executive or the president, and judicial or your courts. So on page 10, you have Article 2 of the Constitution, which directly relates to the functions of the president. It only has 3 sections. There isn't a whole lot there. So the president is very restricted on what he or she can do. What do you need to know? Section 1 says the president will serve a 4-year term. Okay. And they select the vice president. Section 2 says the president is the commander-in-chief of our military forces. That's pretty much all I got out of that paragraph. When you're studying, even though I'm going to skip you for the first couple times you review this material, you may need to read everything in that section on that page in front of you. Because as I mentioned, I'm going to keep stopping for these disclaimers. The exams do not only come from these study guides, competency 1, 2, 3, or whatever for that section. Their laws, their policies, directives, instructions that's listed in the study guide. So if you go, I've had individuals say, I'm going to go to ASMC because this information was not on the exam. Okay, this is not a military school. This is not a high school. They're going to tell you, well, did you read the law that's mentioned, the Chief Financial Officers Act? So, however, I've been doing this for a while. Yes, you can pass the exam by simply understanding everything that's in this book, because you will see it all interrelates with one another. It's not like separate topics. It just seems that way because you're going page by page. So that's why I kind of break it down into small chunks. So commander-in-chief, 4-year term. And then the third one is where it talks about where from time to time, the president will let Congress know what his priorities are in the State of the Union address. Most people don't listen to it, but that's what the purpose of it. And so as we go forward and we're going to look at how legislation is introduced, the way the president introduced his priorities for the upcoming year is through the State of the Union address. So that is Article 2. So again, the exam is multiple choice. So when you have a list of things like this, typically what the multiple choice will say is which one is not a function of Congress, or which one is not a function of the president. Declare war. So it might give you 4-year term, commander-in-chief, state of the union, and declare war. Because you know what right looks like, you know that the president does not declare war. Congress does that. So you have to be able to decipher. And then with all the laws, you need to have the courts. So Article 3, covered on page 1.1.11, talks about the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And the purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret, to make sure that the law is constitutional, non-constitutional. So Congress makes the laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and then the courts will then interpret those laws if we have confusion with it. Any question on the 3 branches of government? So reminder, learn them in that order. Legislative, because it directly relates to Article 1. Executive, Article 2. Judicial, Article 3. So what I'm doing, once you go through a section, stop, pause, and remember, regurgitate, repeat the information again to make sure that you understood what you just read before you move on. All right, so next on page 12, it talks about the legislative process. We're starting from ground zero. We're working our way up. Well, how does something become a law? That's what we're going to talk about. So you have different forms. You got 4 forms. You have bill, joint resolution, concurrent resolution, and simple resolution. Those are actions that happen within the Congress. What you need to know is the differences. If you read the bill and the joint resolution, the bill is a general proposal. Hey, we want this to become a law, general proposal. The joint resolution is, let's say they want to make an amendment to the Constitution. They use a joint, and the word joint tells you your House of Representatives and your Senate working together on the same information. So both the bill and the joint resolution have to go to the president once they're done for the president to sign for those to become law. As you read through the concurrent resolution and the simple resolution, what you will see is neither one of those processes have to go to the president. Those are not laws. Concurrent means there's action that's happening in the House and the Senate at the same time. They're coming up with some type of policy. Simple resolution means that a matter concerning the operation of either one or the other. So it's just one or the other. So bills and joint resolutions go to the president at the end for the president to sign for them to become law. Concurrent and simple resolutions are internal processes to Congress, so they do not go to the president for the president to sign. So where do we get these legislation from? And the Congress level. On page 13, 1.1.13 tells you there's only 3 ways. It's either recommended by the president, and when does the president recommend a law or a policy or something be changed? When does the president do that? Anyone? State of the Union, right? So we just covered that earlier on, and that was what, let's see, I like to flip back. Article 1, Article 2, State of the Union. Article 2, Section 3 talks about the State of the Union. So it says the president can recommend its priorities or policies to during the State of the Union address. A legislation can also be introduced by a member of Congress or by a committee in Congress. So like I tell people, yeah, we make a big deal about voting for president, but really we need to be focused on our congressmen or congresswomen and what they're doing, because they hold the majority of the control of how the government runs. All right, so any question on the legislative process or the origins of a legislation? How do we get a new bill? How do we get a new joint resolution process? All right, so how a bill becomes law begins on page 1114. And if you're you're seasoned like I am, you might remember Schoolhouse Rock. They used to have a video doing when you watch cartoons on the weekend to teach you how a bill becomes law. So here's some keywords starting on page 14. When that legislation that we just talked about, those three entities introduce their legislation, when it's introduced and referred to a committee, then they have to place it in the hopper. That is a term you need to be familiar with. It's like when you're submitting, let's say you're doing an award for somebody. There's a first line of an individual you have to send it to. You got to record it and send it. So you place the bill in a hopper. And then the particular committee that's responsible for that bill will hold these public hearings, and they do their markup. When you write an award, you might be a stellar writer in your eyes, but I promise you somebody's going to find something wrong with your write-up. And so it goes through that markup period. And then you have to go in and justify why you requested that particular action. So public hearings and markup. Place it in the hopper, then it goes through the public hearing and markup. Then the committee take action. So on page 15, what it says, once they do the markup, think of a red pen. I went to school when they used to grade your paper with a red pen. And then whoever submitted that request, they would then return it to them for them to correct. And what it states on the top of page 15 is once they make the correction, it is now called a clean bill, which should be easy to remember because once they mark it up, you got to clean it up. And now it's called a clean bill. You see it's in bold on the top of page 15. Once the bill is clean, all actions must go to the House of Representatives and the Senate. So keep that in mind as we're studying through the CDFM. So the House and the Senate, looking at the same bill, it goes through consideration. And so as you read through that paragraph in the middle of page 15, towards the end, it says, after the bill has passed one body, either the House or the Senate, the title of the bill becomes an engrossed bill. So it started off in the hopper, it got marked up with the red pen, then I had to clean it up, it became a clean bill, and then it was resubmitted to the House and the Senate floor. Once it passes one or the other, it's called an engrossed bill. But guess what? Your House and your Senate, they're not going to always agree. Well, they typically don't agree on some points. So looking at the same bill, they all have to decide, okay, what are our differences? Because only one document can go to the president for the president to sign. So they have to resolve the differences. Whenever the House and the Senate comes together to resolve differences, you will see in the bottom of page 15, it is called a conference committee. So anytime you hear the word conference or conference committee or third chamber, that tells you that they're there to resolve differences. The type of question you may receive or hear or see again somewhere else is, because I know I saw it and I've had individuals say they saw something similar to it, is if the House of Representatives sends 5 members to the conference and the Senate sends 1 member, who has the majority? Or do they have the majority? Would anyone like to answer that? Do they have an advantage? If the House sends 5 members to this committee and the Senate sends 1 member, does anyone have an advantage? If
I
so,
don't think so. I believe each house have its one vote, no matter how many people they send.
outstanding. Thank you. That is exactly correct. You can only have 1 vote, so it doesn't matter if you see it on an exam and they kind of worded something similar to that. Understand, it doesn't matter if you send 50 people, because you might want to bring individual who can support the information. They might be the subject matter expert, and so they're bringing in more information with you, but you can only have 1 vote for the House. So the 3rd chamber, so several names, conference committee, 3rd chamber. What is the purpose of the 3rd chamber? Who would like to answer that?
For the House and the Senate to get together and resolve differences.
To resolve differences. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good answer. Right? So that's the only purpose. And then the final step, once they've resolved their differences, because only 1 document can go to the president for the president to sign for it to become law, on page 16, the last final step is it is then enrolled. So all these words, and they bolded them for a reason to make sure you understand. And if you think of it in the sense of you writing an award or you writing an evaluation or something for someone in the same type of idea and process, is clean it, then it's voted on, it becoming gross, then they got to resolve differences. So you tell it like a story. You'll hear me say that numerous times, is if you tell it like a story and making sure you get the story right, is the final step. It's enrolled and then sent to the president for the president to sign. And then it picks up on page 17. Once it gets to the president has several options. And one we've already talked about. And if you notice, the president's action under Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 says the president has 10 days after the bill is presented to act upon it. So there's several actions. The first one says approval and signature. Congress is in session. The president receives the bill. He signs it within 10 days. It becomes law. Or let's go to the 4th one, the veto. The president does not sign the bill, or he vetoes the bill, sends it back. But what did you learn about veto? What is the power of Congress can do with this presidential veto?
2/3 can override.
Outstanding. 2/3 of the Congress can override it. When you read the paragraph on number 17, on page 17 at the bottom, you'll see it also states that there in veto. I'm going to come back to veto in a minute. All right, let's go to back to the second bullet. Does not sign, but allows the bill to become law. We talked about that in the beginning. How is it that the president doesn't sign something, but it still becomes law? Who can explain that to me? Yes.
If Congress is in session, then it will become law. If it wasn't, then that's when it would be pocket veto.
Okay,
right?
Outstanding. So that is correct. So does not sign, but it still becomes law. This is the same thing that was covered under Article 1, Section 7 on that top page. It's saying the Congress is in session, the president receives the bill, the president does not sign the bill within 10 days, that bill will automatically become law regardless. Because again, it might be an area that the president is like, okay, I don't care if it becomes law. So I'm not going to spend any energy on. And then pocket veto, as she mentioned, is Congress, the president receives the bill, does not sign it within 10 days, but the fact that Congress is not in session or Congress is adjourned means it's a pocket veto. It does not automatically become law. Now, along all these lines with veto, what I wanted to point out, and because the only time I saw this term was on the very last page, 1154, right? I need y'all to write 1996 line item veto. That's LINEITEM veto. It's not listed on this page, but it's the same type of topic. And then if you have your book and you want to see it in writing, you can flip to page 1154, which is the very last page. And sometimes individuals miss it if I don't tell them to write it. You will see what pocket veto is. It meant that I think the last president that was allowed to do it was President Clinton. So all the presidents up to that point, if they receive a bill and they did not like a portion of the bill, they were just lining things out. Nope, don't want it. And then signed the bill and everything else became law. Well, eventually somebody challenged it, went to the courts. The court said it's unconstitutional. And so if the president needs to veto or does not like anything on the bill, the entire document has to go back to the originator. So in this same context on page 17, you need to know what the line item veto is about. 1996, and I think it took effect, what, 1998? Yep, it was declared unconstitutional in 1998. So that means everything prior to that, the president was allowed to line through information on the bill and return and sign the document for it to become law. All right, and are there any questions on anything I've covered so far before we switch gear to the federal budget process? Okay, I don't see any hands and I don't hear any questions. All right, so let's move on to page 1118 as it starts the topic on the budget side. So when we talk about the bill, we were basically looking at in general. The budget process is a little bit different. And so that's what we're going to kind of go through. So the first part of it, I'm going to kind of just flip through. Understand that in the budget process on page 18, you start with budget formulation. You got to come up with the budget request. Then once the budget goes to Congress, you have congressional action. And then once Congress approves the budget and is signed by the president, you have budget execution. Formulation, congressional action, budget execution. When you have a list, you need to know the order of the list in case they throw something else, a fourth one in there, you'll know, okay, no, that's not part of the budget cycle. At the top of page 19, they mention the PPBE process. And actually, if I wrote this book, I would introduce the 3 DoD systems up front, but I think later on, if not, I'll go over it once we're done. I don't remember if it was in this section. So basically, the DoD uses 3 different systems to run its operation. They use JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, to identify capability gaps. And then they determine, is it an acquisition resolution or is it a funding resolution? If it's a funding resolution, at the top of page 19, the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process is used to formulate the DoD budget request. It examines the PPBE process in detail. We're going to look at that. It goes in detail in module 2. Then I flip over to page 21. So the process for budget formulation, and if you think about it in your level, your terms, it starts with OMB guidance. All right, so let's pause here because I see an acronym. What does this acronym mean? It will, what is the term? Behoove you to know what an acronym means, because if they give you an acronym and then they ask you to break it down, it gets real confusing. So my question to you, as we talk about Congress, we talk about the executive branch, we talked about the judicial branch. Why are we receiving guidance from OMB on page 21? What does OMB stand for? Who are they? And why are we receiving guidance from them? Who can answer? All right, let's start easy. What does OMB stand for?
Office of
Office of
Management and
Management and
Budget.
Budget.
Okay, Office of Management and Budget. Okay, got that out the way. Who do they work for? Because again,
The president?
the president, right? They're the resource manager, the budget, the chief financial officer for the president. So which means they're the budget manager or the CFO for which branch of government?
Executive?
The executive branch. You got to be able to tie, remember, you're putting this puzzle together and understand that it all interrelates with each other. So the reason we're receiving OMB guidance because the president is the one that's responsible for the budget, right? You ever hear president's budget, nation's budget? So OMB issues us guidance on the budget. Starts off there. Then based on the guidance, we develop the agencies, organization, Department of Defense, Department of State, and everybody department develops their budget draft. And then the agency submits their budget to OMB. So DOD, at the DOD level, who is responsible for the DOD budget? Or resource manager or chief financial officer. You can use different terms at the DOD level. Because again, you're taking a DOD exam, so you might want to know. And it's going to come up quite extensively. Anybody want to take that one? This budget is talking a budget. So OMB is sending the guidance down to which part of the Department of Defense?
Will that be the CG?
No, but we're going to come back to that one because we haven't talked about that key player yet. No, at the DOD level, there's got to be somebody in charge of budget, right? Because that's how the money's going to trickle down. So the budget guidance comes from OMB down to Department of Defense, but it's got to go to a particular office. If you work for the Army, you'll know it goes to, what is it, ABLE, all right? But at the DOD level, all right, USD Comptroller, y'all ever heard? Under Secretary of Defense for Comptroller. That's the senior budget person at the DOD level. So when OMB is issuing the guidance is going to the USD Comptroller. If on page 21 in that last paragraph, you also see OMB Circular A11. That A11 comes up quite extensively. So anything dealing with the budget formulation, execution, and all of that, we get from that guidance. So I always point out OMB Circular A11 deals with budget process. And so when the agency submits their budget to OMB, USD Comptroller to OMB, there's a period in that paragraph where it tells you they do an internal review during the fall. So it's called the fall review. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth line from the bottom on page 21, you'll see it in quotation marks, the fall review. That is the time when a representative from OMB sits down with USD Comptroller to go over their budget request for that year. Then on page 22, once the OMB makes their final decision on the budget, the DOD budget, let's stick with DOD for now. OMB reviews it, and then it'll tell you, you'll see again in bold, this is formalized. That final document is called the OMB passback. So whenever you hear pass back, that lets you know that's the final budget numbers that OMB is presenting to the president for the president to sign once he's, well, actually for the president to submit to Congress, because the budget goes from the president to Congress, then Congress does their thing, then when Congress settles their resolution in the conference, then it comes back to the president for the president to sign. So OMB pass back lets you know that's the final OMB budget numbers that are going forward. Any question on anything I've covered in this particular area? So we got to walk through the process. All right, so on page 123, let me grab my pen. It talks about decisions by the president. So it tells you on the bottom of page 23, once this budget is formulated, it needs to go from the president to Congress for Congress to deliberate about. And it tells you also the federal budget document is to present it to Congress no later than the first Monday in February prior to that fiscal year that begins 1 October. That's important to know, and you will continuously see that statement throughout the study guide. So when does Congress and when does the president have to submit the fiscal year budget to Congress? No later than the first Monday in February. So it doesn't say has to be the first Monday in February. It says no later than. Key words that kind of stick out. And then on page 24, remember this is a process map. So once the president turns the budget into Congress, Congress has some actions that it takes on that budget. So on page 24, it goes into the following resulted from the Congressional Budget Control and Empowerment Control Act of 1974. Congress focuses on the overall budget. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, so that's another key player that works for Congress. That's their budget folks that pull the numbers together, do the analysis and so forth. So at Congress, there are 3 congressional actions once the president submits the budget. At the bottom of page 24, those are the 3 phases. Budget resolution, authorization process, and the appropriation process. That is the order in which they occur. And so we're going to flip over to page 27 and begin the budget resolution process. So what you need to know is, again, once the president submits the budget request to Congress, Congress goes through the budget resolution process, authorization, and appropriation process. So in the budget resolution, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, what their job is, as you see in the middle of page 27, that paragraph talks about the House and Budget Committees managing that particular function, but the CBO gathers all the historical data, the total budget outlay. I'm going to circle that. We'll circle back to that word. The budget authority, the deficit. Do we have any surplus? How much money have we taken in revenues in previous years? All of that data is gathered by the CBO. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, presents it to the House and the Senate that's responsible for the budget resolution. So which House and which Senate is responsible for the budget resolution process? It's also on that slide at the top of page 27, because you're going to need to know the difference. Anyone want to take it? That way you don't get bored with my voice.
The House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee.
All right, so the CBO, and we'll go to the diagram on the top of page 27, budget resolution process. The CBO gathers all that data, A copy goes to the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. They look at the information on their floor, they determine what they want to approve, what they don't want to approve, then they come together. What's the purpose of them coming together in a conference? To resolve differences. So they're resolving their differences on that particular request, and then it goes back to their floors. Now, if you notice at the bottom of this diagram, it says concurrent budget resolution. Going back to when we started, bill, joint resolution, concurrent, and simple resolution. Concurrent does not go to the president. So the purpose of the budget resolution process is for Congress to determine the guidelines that should be used when looking at the president's budget request. That's the simplest way to put it. And so, as I mentioned on that first bullet at the bottom there, total budget outlay. What is an outlay? An outlay is the same term that we use, for most of us use disbursement. But the formal definition is when the funds are removed from the treasury, that's the bank, to pay for a bill, it is called an outlay. That's the simplified way of the definition. But you're not going to see, I don't think you ever see the word disbursement in this study guide. You're going to see outlay. So you need to know that outlay is the same thing as a disbursement. You pay for the bill. So budget resolution is a responsibility of the House Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, and it does not go to the president for the president to sign. On page 1129, we go into the second phase of congressional action, the authorization process. A different House and Senate is responsible for that. And if you just focus on the diagram at the top, you'll see the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee are responsible for the authorization process. What is the purpose of the authorization process? Who would like to answer that?
The authorized program.
To authorize the programs. So everything that the DoD does, everything that we do, they fall under specific programs. I think it's 11 DoD programs out there. And we'll see that probably in Mod 2. But the purpose of the authorization process is for this particular section of Congress to authorize the category of things that the agency is allowed to do for that upcoming fiscal year. It doesn't mean that if they list funding in the authorization law that you actually have funding to do that mission. The sole purpose, and I'm stressing this because when we go over appropriation, there's a possibility you could see it on an exam where they say, okay, you receive X amount of dollars in the authorization process, and in the appropriation process, you receive a lesser amount. How much do you really have for that program? You have what's appropriated. So you never have funding in the authorization, even if they talk about funding. Does everyone understand that, or did I confuse anyone with that? All right, so you see the process is the same, goes to the House, goes to the Senate, then they come together to resolve differences in the third chamber or the conference. But what the difference between the budget resolution process and authorization, at the end, the authorization process must go to the president for the president to sign, and it becomes a law. The National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, for the defense related. And then on page 31, it goes into the third phase, which is the appropriations process. That's where we get our funding, our budget authority to obligate funding. So what you need to ask yourself here is which House and which Senate is responsible for the appropriations process. This one should be easy because it's the House Appropriation Committee, and the Senate. So the only one that's different is the authorizers are the Armed Services Committee. The budget side and the appropriation side, they both have the words in their title, so that should be easier to remember. And then at the end, at the end of the appropriation process, it goes to the president for the president to sign for that bill or that budget to become law. So under defense size, under the HEC and the SEC, there are 12 subcommittees. So there are 12 appropriation bills that they go over. So on page 33, what they've done is they pull out of that 12, these are the 3 that are specific to the Department of Defense. Again, you're taking a DoD Certified Defense Financial Manager exam. So they focus on page 133 on the defense side of it. So the 3 are Defense Appropriation Bill, Military Constructions, Veterans Affairs, Energy and Water Development. So that means, yeah, you should probably need to know what are the 3 appropriations associated with the Department of Defense. So the next few pages kind of talk about once the budget is approved, appeals can be made to Congress on page 34. Agencies can revise their original estimates on page 35, because whatever Congress approves, that's what you have in that appropriation. And so a lot of time the budget estimates are 18 months old from the time you have to submit them for them to go through the process, to go to the president to Congress, and so forth. So agencies do have an opportunity to revise their original estimates on page 35. And then on page 36, it introduces one page about continuing resolution, because sometimes they can't come to a resolution on the actual budget. So a continuing resolution must be put in place before 1 October. Or what will happen if we don't have an appropriation or a continuing resolution? What happens?
Government
Shut down?
Shut down.
Shut down. And why does the government shut down? If you don't remember none of the other stuff I talked about earlier, why does the government shut down if we don't have one of these?
Article 1, Section 9.
Article
Government
1,
shall
Section
withdraw from
9.
the Treasury.
There you go. Too easy. Article 1, Section 9 says the Treasury is going to shut down if we don't have an appropriation law or a temporary stopgap appropriation law. While you're operating under the CR, because I noticed in Module 1 that the CR is only, well, they give you what, one couple of paragraphs. If you go to Module 2 and Module 3, you're probably going to have 2 or 3 pages on the CR. So that's why I tell individuals is before you take an exam, make sure you review all 3 modules, looking for similar topics or the same type of topics in the different modules, because one section might have more information on the other. But based on your knowledge of continuing resolution, what are some of the guidelines or restrictions we must operate under? Just throw them out there for us.
It has to be ongoing activities.
Ongoing activities, okay. What else? What are you restricted?
No new starts.
No new starts. Good one. What about the same rate of operation? The same rate of operation you operated on the last fiscal year, so same rate of operation. So those are some of the nuances of when you're operating under a CR. You can't come up with a new idea project at that time. Page 37 just kind of gives you a table, a chart, breakdown of the budget resolution, authorization, and appropriations process. Remembering that the budget resolution does not go to the president. that is an internal concurrent action within Congress to determine guidelines of looking at the budget, limitation, fences, floors, and so forth. The authorization, which is the House Armed Services Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee, goes to the president, president signs. The authorization does not give you budget authority, does not give you any funding. Even if funding is listed, it only approves the programs. So I'm making notes, programs. And then the appropriations, once it's completed, it must be signed by the president to become law. So it goes to the president. And from the appropriation, we get budget authority to obligate funds. Budget authority. And then that's why fiscal law accounts for the majority of the question, because starting on page 38, this is actually part of fiscal law. The power of the purse, not only does Congress restrict how much you get, is they also, once you get those funding, there's also restrictions on the use of those funding. So the availability of funding, PTA, purpose, time, and amount. And even though they don't go into details on page 38, remember module 3.1 is the entire fiscal law process that goes into all of this, purpose, time, and amount. Every appropriation have a specific purpose, specific time, and a specific amount. All right, so I think this is a good point for me to ask this question. All right, so Congress gives us all these limitations on the use of the funds. How does Congress know if we're following those rules, those laws, those restrictions? What is the name of the agency that helps Congress determine if we're following those guidelines? Any takers? Here comes another player that's not listed on the page, so don't look for it there, but it's a good point to bring it in, is the Government Accountability Office, also known as GAO. Once Congress gives us all these limitations, they give us the budget, they give us the appropriation, but they have restrictions on the appropriation. We have fiscal law restrictions. And in order for Congress to know if we're actually following them, they have the GAO, Government Accountability Office, that serves as that external auditing agency that works directly for Congress. And the individual that's in charge of the GAO, that position is a Comptroller General, CG. Because sometime in this study guide, you see the acronym just CG. Know that it's not Commanding General. Like most of your typical military reads, it'll be Commanding General. CG in the study guide is the Comptroller General. And the Comptroller General is the title of the individual in charge of the GAO. The GAO works directly for Congress to audit which branch of government. Who is the GAO auditing? Which branch of government is GAO auditing?
The executive.
The executive.
Y'all ready for me today, okay? Yes, GAO is auditing the executive branch, and all you have to think is, who does the budget go to? The budget is approved for the president, for the country. And so GAO is auditing the executive branch. All right, let's go to page 1139. We're still good on time, yes. That diagram at the bottom. So once Congress appropriates the funds, there are two things that always happen. The legal part is the Treasury issuing Treasury warrants. And all that is a notice that the Treasury says, yep, we have an official appropriation law. The bank account is open. Your bank account is open. Treasury warrant, that's the first thing. That's the legal part. Then you have the, I guess you could say, procedural part On the OMB side, OMB begins the apportionment process. We're going to go over these terms again because there's a lot of A words. All right. So when you see the diagram on page 39, it says, as soon as possible, the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. This is after the appropriation bill. Within 10 days, the agencies must submit an SF-132. All right, so this is what it looks like on the OMB side. Appropriation law in place. DOD has to complete an SF-132 once Congress have already approved the budget on the appropriation. DOD and the other agencies must complete an SF-132 within 10 days, and they must submit it to OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So it's basically saying, hey, I see that Congress has appropriated $5 billion for defense. SF-132 says, let me please have my 5 million or whatever you're going to cut. So within 10 days, and then OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. So whenever you hear the word apportionment, that is a function of OMB. They apportion funds. So Congress appropriated the funds, OMB apportions the funds, and what is it called when DOD gives us funding? That's another A word.
An allotment.
An allotment. Outstanding. And DOD issues allotment. So as we're executing, I'm still on page 39. You'll see where it says quarterly in towards the bottom of that SF-133. The agencies must submit an SF-133 quarterly. And it's basically like what we did today, variance report or expenditure report that says, this is how much we gave you, this is how much you obligated or spent, or based on your plan, you didn't spend it all, explain it. So your status of expenditures on an SF-133. Congress appropriates, two things happens. The Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. OMB begins the apportionment process. That process begins when the agencies complete an SF-132 requesting their funds. They send it to OMB within 10 days of the appropriation law, and then OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. The agencies must submit an SF-133 quarterly. So on page 40, it talks about the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant and what it is. You can read that. Page 41, it talks about the apportionment process. And again, when you read through that, it's the OMB is responsible for apportionment. It talks about the SF-132 and the 30 days to respond. Page 42 talks about deferrals and rescission. Because once Congress passes the appropriations, postponements can be requested or cancellations. Maybe we no longer need that fund. But the bottom line is, if the president wants to do anything different from what Congress appropriated or funded, then they have to get permission to do so. So rescission is just canceling. We don't need those funds for that. So on page 43, it says agency, and again, your DOD is for us, is our agency. Agency issues allotment, we commit, we obligate, and then we outlay those funds. And so when you flip all the way over to page 45, that diagram is a good way to pull it all together. And I'm going now. So it says Congress appropriates, Treasury issuing the Treasury warrants, then OMB apportions funds within 30 days to the agencies. The agencies issue allotment, they commit, obligate, and outlay those funds. On page 1145, what I want you to see at the top of that page, because you're gonna see it again in module 2, page 2.1.81 in case you want to refer back, because module 2 has it in more detail. You may be asked, what is the unapportioned amount of this appropriation? So if you, once we're done here and you flip to page 2.181, you will see the practical exercise that you may have to deal with. So unapportioned means that you have some funds that were appropriated, but not yet apportioned. So any question on that? I'd say the best way to understand this is go to page 2.1.81 because they actually have explanations of it. And page 46 just basically says once the execution process begins, then we start the auditing phase. Monitor and review. We want to make sure that we're actually following, because page 47 brings in the GAO, as we discussed earlier, for that congressional oversight. And as I mentioned, agency responsibility, that everything that you need for the module 1 exam may not be just in that 1.1 section, because the exam is not going to tell you, all right, you're in competency number 1. This is competency number 2. It's just going to be random 80 question from any competency from fiscal law also. And so they're telling you agencies in module 1 competency 3 and module 3 competency 4, you have additional information on the same subject. So they're telling you go to those sections to pull more information to make sure that you understand your responsibility as an agency once you get the funding. Like, you know, we're supposed to do internal controls, right? When we get our funding, we're supposed to have our own internal control, and an audit is typically an external organization coming in to evaluate your operation. So a lot of that is what's covered in module 3 competency 4. And so the definitions are on page 49. Those are pretty straightforward. 50, I don't have anything pointed out. I mentioned outlay already. Make sure you know the outlay. So we're going to take you to page 1151 to make sure that you understand how the revenue, how the country receives its revenue, the types of bills, and how that funding is broken down. If you want to memorize percentages, that's up to you. Just understand the overall impact. So on page 51, it's telling you this is how the government makes money. The number one way and why they always threaten to increase taxes is because 50%, half, based on this data from the 2020 study guide, is half of the way the government makes money is from our income taxes. The second highest is Social Security and Medicare. So that is what you need to learn, is if they say which are the highest areas in which the government makes revenue, Social Security, well, individual income tax and Social Security, Medicare. And then you have your smaller percentages, corporate tax, excise tax, and other. And then expenditures on page 52 says all the bills that the country has, how is it broken down? The majority, 70% based on these numbers of all the bills. So think of your own bills. You got to pay, if you want to keep your house, you got to pay your house note. You got to pay for your car. Those are your mandatory bills, at least mine, right? So think about it. 70% of the money on the bills that we're paying are bills must funds. We got to pay them. So 30% is left for everything else. Everything else at the bottom of page 52 says, if you see that breakdown, national defense discretionary. So of that 30%, a little bit more than a half all goes to the Department of Defense. And your Department of Education, Department of Homeland Security, they all get that little piece of the pie, that 14.7%. So that's why you always have the battle. Okay, we need to cut some from DOD because we get the majority of what's called the discretionary spending. And then you have your smaller pockets, Social Security, then Medicare. You got Medicaid, other mandatory, and so forth. But the majority of those are your mandatory. So it's kind of backwards. So let me repeat. Your mandatory bills of that 70% makes up Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory, and interest on the debt. Those are the mandatory. I'm one of those, I have to do things in order. So this kind of throws me. So my discretionary spending is my national defense discretionary and my non-defense discretionary. That's the 30% there. Does everyone understand that? Make sure I didn't confuse anybody. So that's how our expenditures, discretionary versus non-discretionary. Non-discretionary is the same thing as direct, is the same thing as mandatory. So those are three words that's saying the same thing. Non-discretionary, direct, mandatory bills are the same thing versus discretionary expenses. And then you want to review page 53 and 54. 53 is basically giving you some laws that created positions, like the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. At this particular time, it says that it generated the office of the GAO, came out of that. OMB, Office of Management and Budget. And the president must submit that budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. All of that came out of the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. So I typically don't say you have to learn the laws, but there's some of them that you should know because these come up quite often. The fiscal year at that time was 1 July to 30 June. It wasn't until the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act that gave us the CBO, the House and Senate Budget Committee, got the calendar. It changed the fiscal year. So the things I pulled out of the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, the impoundment rules, it pulled out, it changed the fiscal law from 1 October to 30 September. So I thought that was important there. Let's see. The fourth one down, the 1984 Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Reaffirmation Act talks about pay as you go. That means you're not going to get more money, so you need to cut something out and use that money to do something else. So that's basically what pay as you go means. But it talks about in the note, the 1985 and 1987 acts are also referred to as the Graham-Rodham-Hollins Act. That's about as much as I know about it, but it's important to know when they put those notes or bold something. So Graham-Rodham-Hollins is the same thing as the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control. They had one in 87 and 85. Okay. And then finally on page 54, an important one that you should also know is the first one, the 1990 Chief Financial Officers Act, because that comes up quite often. It's basically saying that every organization must be auditable, have that financial auditable system of have oversight. And then you have the 1996 line item veto, as I mentioned in the beginning when we started talking about presidential actions. 1996 up to that point, all presidents were allowed to line through items they disagreed with on a bill. Then they would sign it and everything else become law but that item. And so the courts determined that it was unconstitutional in 1998. And so the president can no longer do that. If they disagree with any portions of a bill, they must return or veto the entire bill and return it to its originator. All right, so all of that concludes CDFM Module 1.1, Competency 1, which is the Government Resource Management Environment. And we got 5 minutes to spare. All right. All right, so what are your questions on anything that we've discussed thus far? So this is kind of how the study group will progress as we go through. It's important, it's necessary for you to review the information we talked about today, because as we move along in the process, then we're going to start talking acronyms. And you got to remember the basic processes that we talked about today in order to progress in the next few weeks. You can't just show up here on Wednesdays and think you're going to get it. I promise you, you're not. So don't waste your time coming if you're not going to dedicate the time for it. It is doable, because the more you read it, the more you go over it, it's like, ah, that makes sense. But if you just look at the study guide as a whole, it won't make any sense to you. All right, since I don't have any questions, if you have not already done so, please make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page. I'm going to post the link in this group and also on our Facebook page so that individuals can come to our YouTube page to get the same video, because you can, at least with the video, you can rewind and so forth as you go over the information at your own time. I think that's all I have for today. Thank you all for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I'll see you guys again next time. Let me stop the recording.